Hi everyone, once again my name is Joshua Meyer and I'm the Cancer Philosopher, and today we'll be talking about the war on cancer that our country and the world is waging. Now, some of you might be familiar with the term the war on cancer. It's actually a term that was used to refer to Richard Nixon's famous signing of the National Cancer Act in 1971. And it was really a turning point in the war on cancer, using the phrase once again, because when Nixon signed that, it was basically showing that the government was fighting cancer, that cancer was the number one thing that the country is fighting, that the world is fighting, and that this is something necessary. This is something that has to be cured. So now, in the next part of this book, of The Emperor of All Maladies, Mukherjee starts to talk about the war on cancer. This is really a pervasive topic throughout the book, but at this point in the book is really where he begins to define it. So now, the war on cancer is really a new model of fighting cancer. It utilized specific mandates, timelines, and goals. And by having everything specific, by having specific ways to do things, and having everything laid out, that sort of developed a frontal attack on cancer. And by attacking cancer, making a frontal attack on it, it was able to, studies on cancer, treatment, cures, etc., were all able to be done at more efficient rates. But this begged a question. Should we really fight this war? Or should we rather work with basic research as we were working with in the past? Now, the difference between basic research and the war on cancer is actually quite simple. The war on cancer was highly specialized, focusing specifically on cancer, trying to find a cure, trying to find a cause, while basic research was performed without thought on practical ends, and it really was just to result in general knowledge. However, some people argue that if we lost the focus on basic research, then the war would only get to a certain point, because without the basic research, without all the facts, without all the knowledge to back up what we're doing, we won't really know where to go. And basic research can allow us to answer a large number of important practical problems later on. So basic research wouldn't even hinder our approach to curing cancer. It would rather broaden it, and it would even allow us to pursue different fields. So instead of focusing all our energy on the war, we should instead focus our efforts on basic research, which allows us to expand to different fields, and may also allow us to go further, because the war can only go to a certain point. However, as we can see through history, that basic research approach wasn't as much favored, and people did indeed pursue the war. Now, one of the very important things that happened in the war was the invention of chemotherapy. I didn't mention this in the previous videos because in the chronology that I'm dealing with here, chemotherapy had not yet been invented. But chemotherapy was different, as I'll describe in a moment. But first, what is chemotherapy? So chemotherapy, as described in the book, they bring up an example where chemotherapy was described to patients as a 4-step procedure. Induction, where first we give the patient chemotherapy. Intensification, where over time we give them more and more and more. Chemotherapy is unfortunately a very painful process, but that's the way we get rid of every last cancer cell. Step 3 would be maintenance, where we maintain the person's body after giving the chemotherapy. We are often used together with other different drugs, sometimes other different chemotherapies, as we'll discuss in a moment, leading to the last stage, which would hopefully be cure. And it was this 4-layered approach, just to make it sound easy to patients, that was laid out. Now, chemotherapy was involved with a lot of combinations. So we see over here a picture of a man by the name of Charles Gordon Zubrod, and he proposed the creation of a consortium of researchers in order to share patients, trials, data, and knowledge. Now, what Zubrod was going off here was that people, like we said before, we have this 4-stage step of chemotherapy, but scientists started to combine chemotherapies together. They took some of the most powerful chemotherapies ever. For example, we'll talk about in a minute about a chemotherapy known as VAMP, V-A-M-P. We'll talk about it in a minute, but anyways, by combining chemotherapy, scientists thought they could get further, and by taking the strongest chemotherapies, making them stronger, even in some cases, this will come in the next video, but essentially wiping the body of everything and then putting back what it needs. That ended up being, it relates to graft-host disease. Essentially, what happens is you can sort of wipe all the cells in the body. It ends up wiping everything in the bone marrow, and then you give the patient new bone marrow. So essentially, using combinations of chemotherapy can wipe out all the cancer cells. But seeing as so many studies were going on, Zubrod proposed the creation of a consortium. And now this consortium also, once again, showed a new step. This is how it relates to philosophy of science. A new step in sharing, a new step in collaboration. And what Zubrod is saying that in order to fight cancer, we can't just all start our own thing again and again. We not only have to share the way that we're doing things, we have to share what we're doing. We have to actually share the patients, share the trials, share the data, and share the knowledge. But now these new chemotherapies, of course, lead to yet another question. How do we test chemotherapy? Chemotherapy, of course, requires a control arm. So you have both your control and experimental groups. In another couple videos, we'll discuss how this led to some problems. There's actually some interesting things that came up later on. This is more later developments of chemotherapies, but how exactly do we test them? And the solution was inspired by antibiotics. Scientists thought back to the time when they were first of all, such as penicillin, when they started to test patients on it. In order to show that penicillin, for instance, actually had an effect that would be beneficial to patients, they had to, of course, run studies on them. Now, these studies parallel the same things with cancer, randomization. What they would do is they would take some patients and they would give them the antibiotic, and take other patients and they wouldn't give them the antibiotic, and then they would test how many of the patients were cured. So essentially, what Zubrod is really the one who led this together with Sidney Farber. They developed a cancer cooperative model where dozens of doctors, nurses, and patients in 3 independent hospitals had yoked together to follow a single formula in order to treat patients. This relates back to the consortium, but essentially what they did here is they came up with a new way of testing everything. And as the book says, this work is one of the first comparative studies in the chemotherapy of malignant neoplastic disease. However, later, this cancer cooperative model started to fall apart. Now, VAMP, like I mentioned before, is composed of 4 different chemotherapies: vincristine sulfate, doxorubicin hydrochloride, methotrexate, and prednisone. And prednisone. And sorry for the pronunciation, but essentially, VAMP was one of the most powerful chemotherapy combinations that they could use. It was a high-dose drug. It was life-threatening. It was a 4-drug combination therapy for leukemia. And it was a terrifying idea to many physicians. Now, when Drs. Skip, Frey, and Fervor proposed this, and they said that we should treat patients with this powerful approach in order to get rid of every last cancer cell, physicians thought they were crazy. And what they did is they came to, once again, Zubrod, who was leading a lot of these consortiums, and they said to him, look, this is what we have to do. This is how we're going to do it. Zubrod was a bit wary about it, but after looking into it, he agreed with their approach, and he decided that we have to do something because this is going to work. So in order to do this, he actually had to split from the acute leukemia group B, which is a part of this consortium. And that's really interesting that they split this because Frey, one of the doctors who was leading this, who was leading the VAMP approach, was actually the chairman of ALGB. And they split from ALGB in order to pursue VAMP. And that was something within the spirit of cancer research that was really important, that scientists were willing to give up their own prestige, give up their own positions in order to fight the war. Now lastly, what the author does in this section is he brings up some points about RSV. RSV is a virus that people, that they didn't really, it's known as the Rouse sarcoma virus, based on Peyton Rouse, the guy who discovered it. It originally wasn't linked to cancer at all. They found this virus and scientists were not really sure what it was. But Peyton Ross, when he looked into it, he found that it was related to cancer, and they saw that patients who had RSV had a higher chance of having cancer. So this led him to the next, to his hypothesis that perhaps RSV is a cancer-causing virus. Scientists had long been looking for a cause of cancer, and this was one of them. At first, scientists thought that maybe all cancers were caused by viruses. Of course, that was later disproven, but it was a really important step because scientists were long arguing that we were looking for the cure before the cause. That relates back to the general research principles, where they were saying that if we're looking for a cure before the cause, we can't succeed. In order to find a cure, we need the cause. And if you're just looking for a cure, you're just going to try every single poison out there, every single chemotherapy until it works. And if you just try everything until it works, well, then we're aimless. And the whole point of a war is that you have a goal. And that's resonating throughout the book here, that we have a war on cancer, we have goals, we have methodologies, and if we're just throwing things all over the place, if we shoot up into the air, well, your bullets are not going to fall on the enemy, and it's not going to work. And you may even hurt yourself. So that was really a big invention here with RSV, showing that even though we're looking for the cure, we can still find the cause at the same time. And that backed up a lot of claims by physicians looking for the cures. And it really showed that perhaps the war was the right approach. And maybe we are on the right way to curing cancer.